All right, we're back at the Cracks in Postmodernity. Today we have Alex Blum, who's a writer from LA. He works in the video gaming industry, has a big interest in MMA, which is what something he wrote about for us in the latest copy of the Zine, Volume 2. Alex, thank you for coming.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, so before we get into this essay you wrote for the Zine, tell us a little bit about how you got into MMA, UFC. What's the backstory here?
Totally. So it started out kind of listening to videos made by Chael Sonnen, who's a former fighter who has one of the biggest personalities in the sport. One of his most recent points of interest was he was locked in a hotel room in Miami and was jumping into Ariel Helwani's live stream, typing, saying, I'm stuck. There's George Masvidal's goons are surrounding me. I don't know what to do. I need help. And Ariel was just looking at the chat saying, that's not really Chael. He's not that big of a moron. He would find some better way to get in contact with me. That's not him, and it was really him, and that was his last line
Wow.
of defense to get out of that situation. But yeah, he would publish a lot of videos about the sport, kind of focusing on the personalities of fighters, and I think that was something that really drew me in, particularly the personality of fighters like Tony Ferguson, who is, who he does have some legitimate mental issues that he's worked through. There was a moment where he kind of had a lapse in his consciousness with his wife, where he was like screaming at her and convinced she was a witch, and like he ran out of the house. And it gets into kind of some of the darker aspects of MMA where you do have brain damage and the decline of cognitive function. But Tony Ferguson was one of these guys who was just all passion, just sort of raw energy, very little in the way of technique in terms of defending his face. He would just take punches, but he was able to tough his way through it and just had this marauding berserker kind of style. And he really brought me into the sport. And so it's very ironic that the first event that I saw, UFC 249, was really his downfall.
Mm.
And it was the first fight back during the pandemic. It was no crowd. You could hear every punch landing flush on his face. It was just incredibly impactful. It was the most damage that I've ever seen a fighter take in a single fight against Justin Gaethje, and it was just an utter tragedy. It was like, it's probably overused to say that it's a Greek tragedy or something like that, but it really was, because he was on a 12 fight win streak. He was supposed to fight Khabib Nurmagomedov, the greatest fighter in the weight class. He had this title fight scheduled for, I believe it was the fourth or the fifth time. Previously, he'd pulled out of that title fight because he tore his ACL tripping on a microphone cable. Just absurd. Yeah, just fate working against this man in every single way possible. And then he finally has the title fight booked again. And what happens? The COVID pandemic happens. Khabib gets stuck in Russia, and the company, and Tony's always a company man. He's always going to do what's right by the UFC, whether it's good for him or not. And so he takes a short notice fight against Justin Gaethje, who just put it on him for 24 minutes of one of the most brutal beatdowns I've ever seen. And Tony was already 35 years old at the time. I believe he was 35 or 36. So he was already at that point of decline. And then he just takes life-changing damage in this fight at the height of his powers. And he's never been the same since. He's since lost six consecutive fights, I believe, at this point. And that was my first event coming in. I was actually doing some betting. I was in New York State. I had some bets on Tony Ferguson by KO. I had some bets on Dominic Cruz as well. I thought it was going to be a real showing of, these great personalities that I'd become invested in through hearing about the sport. And now finally watching a live event, I was ready to see them in action. And both of them got destroyed in very anticlimactic and violent ways. And I think that kind of speaks to the soul of the sport in a way where it is just this endless turnover kind of. And no matter how good you are, uh, in 3 years, the likelihood is that you're not going to be where you once were if you're anywhere near 32, 33 years of age at that time. But yeah, and I have the UFC 249 poster on my wall here, and every single fighter from that event is now no longer at the highest level. I mean, for a minute there, it was still Justin Gaethje and Francis Ngannou, and Ngannou was looking like he was really going to be one of the greatest ever, going to boxing and having that fight with Fury, and then he just gets finished by Joshua in that way so suddenly, and now it's unclear if he'll even fight it for PFL at this point. That fight may not even happen until like the winter or later. But yeah, they've all turned over completely. There's no one on that poster who's at the top anymore right now.
So can you explain like everything you're describing to me as like an outsider, because I really don't know anything about UFC, is like kind of grotesque and barbaric. So like what is the appeal? Like what is it? Because you speak about it with like, I mean, such detail and kind of passion. So yeah, like what is it that draws you into watching it?
For sure. I mean, I think one thing is I've always been interested in great fight scenes. Like especially growing up, I was a big fan of particular animes, like One Piece, Full Metal Alchemist, things like that. And there was something about a great fight scene where it's the personality really just speaks through physicality. And it's something where in kind of our hyperverbal and academic world and kind of a lot of my other interests where they're like theological and historical, and it's just very dense and there aren't very clear conclusions a lot of the time. You just need to dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and often that just yields more and more questions. But with fighting, there is something about it where it's unlike other things in the modern world where you put one person against another person and there's going to be a very specific outcome and you're going to know that
Mhm.
night who they thought they were. And I think that's the part of it that's so compelling is it's like to go into fighting, you have to be delusional at a certain level to think that you're really one of the best in the world and you can really just win that belt. And so when you're up against another person who also has that same exact self-belief that they
Mhm.
think they're going to be the best in the world, they're going to win the belt, they're going to be number one ranked, you're just in their way, this is just a complete clash of wills, and someone has to be wrong about who they think they are. Someone has
Mhm.
to be the journeyman. Someone has to be the person who's going to retire with 15 losses on their record, who started out undefeated 9-0, and then the other person might actually get to the belt or challenge for it and lose, but still go down as kind of a legendary figure in the sport who was able to float around the top for a while. Or you might not even get to the top. You might get a chance to fight for like the number 15 ranked spot and lose that fight and then still put on good
Yeah.
fights kind of in the unranked area of the sport, but you're just never going to be one of the best and you're never going to get that respect, prestige, and payday. And so I think a large degree of what makes it compelling is just that question of who are you? What did you think you were going to do with your life? And when it all comes down to it, by the age of 36, 37, some of the higher weight classes you can last a little longer in the sport, but generally by the time you're in your mid 30s, you're going to know if you were good enough to have done it or not. And you had to devote your entire life to try to get there. If you're 1 foot in, 1 foot out, you're just not going to be able to perform at the highest level. So it's an all in gamble to just see if you actually could be one of the best. And you're either going to be really correct or really, really wrong. And it is a very insane thing that you just don't see in other career paths where things just kind of go on and on for decades and decades and there isn't really a clear result. With fighting, there is just a very clear result, and you either are as good as you think you are or not. And that just makes it very appealing in sort of a postmodern world and a kind of a world where things just aren't very clear. There's always another maze, there's always another turn. With this, it's definitive. Two wills, two sets of techniques clash, and one of them is proved superior. And it's often very surprising. You often think that you have a fight. The ones that you're the most certain about sometimes turn into the ones where it was a complete beatdown in the opposite direction. And it's just people surprise you. And that's a useful thing to kind of learn in life as well, is just when people have the capacity to truly surprise you and you had them pegged as a mid-level guy, he's never going to be at the top, he's pretty average, and then he just puts on a masterclass against a great guy in the division and you just think, you know, it creates kind of joy in a sense. That is where sort of some of the joy and the grandeur of the sport can come from, are
Mhm.
moments like that where someone like, say, a fighter like Charles Oliveira, who got into the company when he was like 20 years old. He was losing a lot, he was losing in very humiliating ways. Like he had one fight where like 1 minute into the fight he just had an esophagus injury and it kind of looked like he quit in a certain way, like he just kind of collapsed on himself. And he's had these lapses where it's just felt like the grit to go on was not there. And then late in his career, he turns into this guy who gets knocked down 2 times, stands back up, and then knocks the other guy out within like a 4 minute window. He's been dropped brutally twice, and then he drops Justin Gaethje and chokes him out and wins the fight in the very first round. And he went from the guy who was kind of quitting on himself very easily at a young age to this guy now in his early 30s who is just taking punishment, doesn't care, and is just putting on some of the most exciting, inspiring victories you could possibly imagine.
So, okay, but what I hear you saying is the appeal. There's this lack of predictability, which is, I don't know, like I feel like I guess you kind of become accustomed to being able to like, I don't know, being able to like predict everything thanks to whatever algorithms or whatever technological kind of innovation, but there's something kind of pre-modern about all this. Um, but so like did you get into like actually doing MMA after starting to watch UFC or was that beforehand?
Oh, I've never trained or anything like that. Uh, but yeah, what you're saying about the unpredictability, that is very insightful. And, I think that does speak to a lot of it because I noticed that I don't really like to watch fights back all that much.
Mhm. Okay.
Sort of, if it's like a shorter fight, I can watch it back, like kind of like some of these short, exciting fights, like Charles Oliveira versus Justin Gaethje. That's like a really amazing fight to watch if you just want to like get a sense for what's appealing about the sport. Uh, but other than those sort of like quick and exciting fights, if you already know how it ends, it does, for me personally, sort of suck the air out of the situation,
Mhm.
because so much of it is just the unpredictability of it and just not knowing who is better on the night. Um, but yeah, I haven't gotten into training or anything like that. I know a lot of people who watch sort of get into jujitsu and things like that, which are aspects where you really don't take the brain damage.
Yeah.
And that is kind of a good way to go about it. But I would say doing it is only appealing like if you really have the physicality for it, because that's another aspect of it that makes it so
Mhm.
interesting is it is just like genetics and what people are born with, and there's certain things you can't control where it's like something that gets talked about in the sport is like chinniness. Like some fighters are chinnier than others. And there's some fighters at the very top of the sport, like Charles Oliveira, who, if they had no chin, if they were just getting knocked out cold by shots, their fight style wouldn't work. They would have to
Interesting.
have retired at a young age. They would have just taken countless losses. And that's just a
Um,
very interesting dynamic there where it's like out of your control completely.
so okay, but you've never like trained in any type of combat sports before.
Right, correct.
Would you?
I mean, I think I would
Okay.
potentially. It would just sort of need to be. I don't know. I think in terms of like what would be the goal of it. And so I know
Mhm.
personally I will never be good enough. Like I feel like my athletic peak would be like maybe being like a 50-50 fighter in the amateur leagues,
Okay.
or like losing three times in the amateur leagues and like maybe putting on a good showing. So I'd have to think that I could get somewhere with it. But I mean, it could be a good alternative, just like going to the gym. Like the typical like Planet Fitness, like if you were going to a boxing gym instead, it could be a good alternative to that for sure.
Okay, interesting. Because so like my trainer used to be a like I guess an amateur UFC fighter of some sort. And he's taught me some stuff, but like I know I would never actually get into a fight with someone because that would go downhill very quickly. But that being said, there's something like very it's kind of making me thinking of what you say, like when you're watching it, that there it brings out it helps you understand something about human nature, like this first of all, like the discipline it requires, the endurance, but also this, I don't know, like the aggressive tendencies that are, I guess, kind of suppressed by this kind of technocratic age, the just the lifestyles that we become accustomed to. But yeah, like there's definitely like it brings something out of you that's normally there really isn't a space for it normally. So like I get that appeal. But like my question is like I don't know, like personally I don't enjoy watching it because like I don't like blood and gore. But I don't know, like what do you say to people who object to watching UFC on the grounds that it's barbaric or it's like promoting I don't know, like denigrating other people and their dignity?
Right? It's a good question. I would say at a certain level, like for fighters, it provides a way to be a professional athlete. Like if someone
Mhm.
wants to live that life and be a professional athlete, you're like in say the 145-pound division, that's kind of a smaller person, you would have no shot at basketball, you'd have no shot at the NFL. Like those sports really cater to kind of very specific body types.
Mhm.
And in combat sports like UFC, one, PFL, even boxing, you have divisions all the way down to like for women's, like I believe it's like atom weight is 105 pounds, and then for men it goes down to 125 pounds. So for people that are born with sort of like a smaller body stature, you really can get to the top of a sport and compete against people with that similar stature in combat sports, where kind of the Premier Leagues, like to be in the NFL, you really just need to be, the equivalent of like a heavyweight in the UFC, and that's why sort of the heavyweight division in the UFC and in other leagues really is very lacking compared to a lot of the others. I mean, there's a lot of kind of what's colloquially the YouTuber Lucas Tracy colloquially refers to them as like blobs, just kind of a lot of guys who are like gigantic and not particularly skilled. And that's because the financial incentive, if you really would be a heavyweight in the UFC, would be to try for the NFL or something like that if you really want to make tens of millions of dollars. But for people without that potential, and this is sort of what like the bantamweight champion Sean O'Malley, who's 135 pounds, said was like he always dreamed of being a basketball player, but he's not close to 6 feet tall, so he had
Yeah.
to kind of reconfigure that, and the UFC and combat sports in general provides it. And I think for certain people that want to be more physical kind of with their careers, I mean, there is sort of a dearth of options potentially, and it does provide kind of an exciting life where it's like even if you are a journeyman, there is something to that. Like if you're never going to get to the belt and you're just going to kind of float around taking fights, there is
Mhm.
kind of something magical about being able to play back a fight for your kids or family or whatever and be like, yeah, I was flown out to South Korea and I took on this guy and it was a war and it was like this was me in the youth of my life. I was able to do these
Mhm.
incredibly exciting things that if there was no such thing as combat sports, someone like that might have just had a desk job or a manual labor job, and there would be nothing specific they could point to in their career as like this was a night where like the whole world was watching me and my skill set was relevant to millions of people and it brought them entertainment and it was exciting and it was an adventure to go to another country. They could go their whole lives without anything like that, and I think there is kind of an appeal there to being part of something like that.
Yeah, I mean, so I asked this question to a lot of our followers on Instagram, like, what do you make of the moral implications of combat sports? And like a lot of people said that like stuff like MMA, especially put in the context of the UFC, yes, like they had the complaint like, okay, it's barbaric, that especially like I guess the kind of commercialized context of UFC and like these narratives that they build, especially at the press conferences where like people are cursing each other out and like whatever, that there's kind of a lack of order and respect that some of the other combat sports have. Like I don't know, like a lot of people were saying with something more traditional like wrestling or boxing, there is a sense of honor that you have like supposed to show respect for your opponent. And part of it's because like the rules and regulations are much more clear. But then other people were saying that like they think MMA is valuable because of the discipline that it requires, but also that like it's healthy to have an outlet for the bloodlust that's not like in actual real life killing people. So I don't know, like if you look at some of the other forms of combat sports, like I don't know, like what is MMA's relationship to them? Like, do you think there's something a little more, I don't know, like is there something that's different on a moral level compared to some of the others in your eyes?
It's tough to say. I know boxing has had more actual deaths. In the UFC, there has not been a death to date. Fingers crossed, and
Yeah.
pray to God that that continues to be the case. But that has definitely been the case. And you talk about bloodlust and kind of channeling that. There is something to that as well, where like there's one fight, Strickland, who has stated openly that he was abused as a child, and my aggression at a level where if he wasn't a fighter, he probably gone off the rails and done some really bad things if fighting was not an open career path to him and he wasn't able to spar in the gym to kind of take out those feelings that are really have been layered into him as a consequence of childhood abuse. And so there is sort of a social function there where certain people like that who fight for those reasons are able to do something that kind of saves them in a way. um, but I know, I believe, was it St. Augustine who wrote kind of against the Colosseum and how Christians should not attend the Colosseum and that this is a
Yeah.
vile practice. Definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because like when you think about for the Greeks at least, very different from the Romans, like wrestling and boxing were part like I don't know, like for Socrates, like there was a very philosophical, virtuous dimension to it. And like I don't know, like when I think of UFC, I think more of like the Roman kind of decadent, indulgent ideal because again, like I don't know, like I'm very fixated on the press conferences and how they frame these fights as this, yeah, as this like very like the bloodlust plays a huge role and the fact that it kind of feeds into people's very base instincts. I'm like, I don't know, these narratives don't appeal to me. Whereas again, like if it's some of the other sports, you don't, I mean, unless it's like WWE, of course, that's like super hyped up and fake. But I don't know, like when you're watching the press conferences, like what is your reaction? Like how do they impact you watching the kind of like the rivalry that they build up there?
totally. Well, that's a really good question because I think it could even be a part of the article as sort of like the gentrification of the UFC. And I think you've seen a lot of that in the press conferences over the
Yeah,
years, where like back in 2018, like McGregor versus Habib, this was the biggest fight in the history of the sport. And that was one of the ugliest buildups. That was like an all-time ugly level buildup to a fight where McGregor was, insulting Khabib's nationality, his father, his religion. And Khabib was saying, no matter what happens, I will never be okay with this guy. He's a blood enemy to me, and those sorts of things are, I think, quite unusual in the sport. Most of
yeah.
the heat and the buildup, where you do see it, it'll be before the fight. Like say Max Holloway versus Alexander Volkanovski, like they had this trilogy, and before the third fight, there was some trash talk and there was some heat. But by the time the fight ended, generally you see hugging, you see, hands on shoulders, and you're the greatest. You brought me to be a better version of myself. This is something that they often tell each other after a fight is, you made me better. This is something that like Dustin Poirier and Islam Makhachev very recently. That was a title fight in June. That was sort of the vibe coming out of that fight, where it was sort of a heated buildup, where Dustin knew it was his last shot, and he was saying things like, no, I'm gonna knock you out. Like you got to be ready. And Islam was, very dismissive. He was saying this guy gets choked out every fight. This guy has nothing. And so it was a very fun buildup. But then when they're actually in the cage and at the end of the fight, there's nothing but respect at that point because they know what they just put each other through. And in that fight, it was a 5 round war where it was expected to be kind of a quick win for Makachev, but Makachev went in with staff and a few injuries, and Dustin was at the absolute height of his powers and his desire to be a champion. And if you go through 20 plus minutes of competing willpower with two people that strong headed at the end of it, there is just love and respect, and respect between both teams. And Dustin came out and he shook Khabib's hand, who's Khabib's coach, and they had a moment where they were talking to each other about their legacies in the sport and how much they mean to one another. So I think you see a pattern there where there's a lot of heat before the fight, but then that's a lot of that is just to kind of build things up and get into it. And then afterwards it deflates and becomes respect. And in terms of the gentrification of press conferences, you've really seen a lot of them get a lot shorter. And Dana White in particular as a figure, he really wants to clamp down on a lot of the heat and is not allowing it. Like there was one press conference with George Masvidal and Kevin Holland, I believe it was like last year in Miami, where they were starting to kind of go at each other. And Dana intervened and said, they're not fighting each other. Don't ask questions about them. Don't get them to antagonize each other. Like, stay out of it. So that's kind of
Mhm.
interesting because that could even be good marketing and build up a fight and make money. But he was intentionally clamping down on it because those are two guys whose camps are known for kind of fighting outside of the ring sometimes. And so there was just an immediate desire to not have that happen. This is a Disney ESPN product. And
Yeah.
the UFC is kind of a Disney product at this point, which is very interesting. And, it has contributed to some of the watering down of the sport where they're just contractually obligated to put on a certain number of cards every year. So whether or not there's, enough of a stacked card for it to be worth attending, they'll just throw it in the Apex, which is the facility with no audience, and put on kind of a lousy card there where no one would be buying tickets. But
Yeah, so I want to get into the essay you wrote for the zine now because I mean you start out with like during COVID, these people were fighting in like empty venues, and you say like this kind of marked the vibe shift that would go on to really change the fate of UFC. So like tell people who aren't familiar a little bit about like what was going on during COVID and what was your take on these empty arenas.
totally. So the UFC was the first league to come back, I believe, in the United States during the pandemic. They like tested all the fighters and did a totally crowdless arena to try to make it completely okay for not spreading the disease. And they initially tried to come back extremely early. I believe it was like April 2020. They were going to fight at a place called Tachi Palace in, I believe it was California, just sort of like a very small like arena attached to, I believe it was a casino. And that got canceled by the governor and health officials in California, just saying we absolutely demand Disney not put this on. So then they moved to Jacksonville, Florida, in the ViStar Veterans Memorial Arena, and that was where they held UFC 249, which was the first event back from the pandemic, totally crowdless. And the feeling was you could really just hear all of the punches in a way that you normally would not. You would hear the commentators kind of echoing to a degree where the fighters can hear what the commentators are saying. If a commentator is saying, like he keeps kicking that leg, a fighter can actually begin to hear that and kind of like take corner advice from the commentator. And it was really, the loneliness of the sport was really kind of conveyed in that moment. And also, in the first live event that I attended, it was with a crowd, but for the very first fight, there's almost no one in the arena, and I was up in the nosebleeds, and so the cage is so far away. and it just sort of feels like they're fighting at the bottom of the ocean or something. They're just so distant, and it's just these two people in the arena that are so far away you can't hear anything when you're that far from them. And it is a lonely sport. It is one on one. Your career is just what you can do, and when you can no longer do it, it's finished. And so I think the Apex really kind of showed a lot of that. And when you had legendary fighters who were nearing the end of their run in the Apex era, it was very sad. Where, for example, like former champion Tyron Woodley was just taking all of these very hard losses with absolutely no crowd. There are fighters like Donald Cerrone who were really at the end of their careers, just getting beat over and over with no crowd in an empty arena. And there is something very brutal about that. But also something that really speaks to the shortness of life about that, because there
Mhm.
is a reality to, like, when you're out of your 30s, you just aren't young anymore, and you are entering into a phase of life where your body isn't going to do what it used to be able to do. And in fighting, that's just very exaggerated, that transition into old age, where you really just notice you're no longer at the top of your game. But you can really see it play out in real time with a lot of these fighters. And when they've built their careers in front of crowds and playing up to the crowd and doing big speeches at the end of their fights, and then now they're just kind of doing a speech for ESPN on TV with absolutely no crowd, and it's the last fight of their career because they have no ability to fight anymore. They're not as good as they were. They're not going to be able to keep going, and they just retire in an empty arena in front of absolutely nobody. It sort of does speak to the smallness of individual life in a way that I think is brutal, but also true. Um, and also just sort of like when people outlive their usefulness, so to speak. Like you see it in fighting when you're no longer good anymore, and you get like a 3, 4, 5 fight lose streak at the end of your career, and you're just sort of out. But you see this with a lot of industries and a lot of people where especially this year with like 90,000 tech layoffs or something like that, where it's like, where are these people going to fit in? Where are there going to be 90,000 new jobs created? There is just a very brutal thing going on right now in one of the worst job economies that I've seen in my lifetime. Since like the 2008 financial crisis was kind of the last time it's been anywhere near this bad in my memory. But you really just do see this concept of usefulness, and when people's usefulness run out, they get laid off, they lose their jobs, and you really just sort of see that exaggerated because it's the physical body that's being worn and torn. But I think it happens spiritually to people all the time.
Yeah, so then you go on to talk about how like yeah, it's there are less of these fights in smaller cities now. It's kind of all concentrated into these big venues, these big ticket matches. And you kind of say that there's this managerial shift within the UFC that you say it's about like move fast, break things. It's about churning out more and more content without real regard for the quality of it, the integrity. And I think, I don't know, you're implying that this is a reflection of just the state of like capitalism in general, the state of our society. Say more about like, yeah, the larger implications of this five shift in the UFC, and what do you think it has to do with what's happening in our society in general?
Definitely. And it's a big topic. It sort of leans into like, brand new cars that break down within the first year of having them and require massive repairs, and unreliable new tools. Like, you buy a hammer, in a brand new hammer, and it just only lasts a few years before it's kind of worn out, versus kind of like a hammer made in the 70s or 60s where it's like you could still have it. And it's just the idea of creating things that break quickly so that they need to be replaced quickly. And so if you put on a lot of fights really fast, no individual fighter really matters. It's rather just the brand, and
Yeah.
Dana White becomes the face of the company, and it's more about it being the UFC than any specific fighter. And I think that that's something that you've seen, especially like when Conor McGregor broke out. He was this massive star. He transcended the sport. He was on Conan late night. He boxed Floyd Mayweather, and he's really the only guy that's ever done that. And when you see him take multiple losses in a row and then snap his leg, and then he's recently pulled out of this fight he was supposed to have, and it's unclear if he ever will fight again. I think you saw a transition in that time where it has to be about just the brand and not about any specific fighter, because McGregor's gone and all these great faces are gone, like Khabib. They just disappear, and it's just this revolving door of great personalities and legendary people that are just on their way out at all times. And so it just becomes more about the brand. And there's a degree to which that's necessary because fighters have short shelf lives, but then there's a degree to which it's just awful and ruins the sport, because then it just becomes about, oh, it's a UFC fight night, and it's like, well, who's fighting? And it's like, well, nobody anyone cares about.
Mhm.
But it's just part of the brand, so we're just going to throw it out there anyway. And if people start tuning out, don't worry. Within 3 weeks, we're going to have a massive pay-per-view again, and everyone's going to come back and watch for the big title fights. And then the week after the title fight, we'll just do, one of the least stacked cards you can imagine, with the fighters that are just very low level. I think you've seen an increase in low level fighters and kind of an inflation of the roster because they've had Dana White's Contender Series, which is kind of every fall where they put on a lot of midweek fights for low level fighters to get into the UFC. But a lot of these people are just not necessarily at the level yet. So the more Contender Series fights that they have, the more signings they have, the more you see cards just fill up with these brand new fighters that are in bookings, and to the point where, in your typical card, maybe half of it is just fighters you've never even heard of anymore, and the turnover rate is just extremely magnified. And so it is really sad to see kind of big personalities not matter and just a corporate brand matter, and you see it uh, all the time with big companies that, where it's more about the Apple brand or the Microsoft brand or the Boeing brand, and the specific people involved rotate in and out. 10 years goes by and none of the same people at that company are even there anymore, but it's still the same company, but all the people who did the magic have moved on or gotten laid off or found other jobs or retired, and so it's not the same thing. It's just a husk, but it has the same name. And so it's an interesting scenario where, like, in 5 years in the UFC, so I would have to think of almost all of the recognizable names that are out there right now. Alex Pereira, Alex Volkanovski, Max Holloway, Islam Makhachev. In 5 years, they're all going to be retired or gone or at the very end of their careers. And so it is an extremely rapid turnover, and it's an extremely young sport because it's only been around, I believe, since the late 90s was the UFC buy-in, and it's changed a lot since then. But it's designed to kind of burn through people in a sense, because you just can't fight into your late 30s, and you can't perform excellently as an athlete in your late 30s at that highest level. Um,
Yeah, so I mean, just to kind of bring everything together, like, what do you think it would take for the UFC to kind of get its integrity back? Like,
yeah.
what should be their aim moving on into the future?
It's a great question. I mean, they used to do things like sponsorships on shorts where specific fighters, because Dana always says this is an opportunity, not a career. You need to market yourself. So fighters used to be able to market themselves and create brand sponsorships and like wear brands on their shorts for them specifically to get paid. That all ended. They did a deal with Reebok and then now a deal with Venom where it's just a uniform short, and you can't have any specific brands. But the cage is plastered with brands that pay directly to the UFC, and that pay does not trickle down to the fighters. Same thing with like The Rock, who had a shoe deal to introduce to the UFC where he designed a special shoe for the fighters to walk out in, and all the payment for that just goes straight to the company. It does not go to the specific fighter wearing the shoe. So I think rewarding the fighters for marketing themselves in that way was something that they used to do, but just no longer are able to do because the company prioritizes these brand partnerships more so than letting individual fighters create those brand partnerships, with the exception of super massive fighters that like launch their own whiskey brands or something like that. But that's only going to be available to like the top 1% of fighters. Most do not have the profile to do that. And I think just more kind of travel around the world and around the nation. Like coming back from COVID, it's been very slow. They're trying to do more fight nights in small American towns, but it's nowhere near what it used to be. They used to do roving press conferences where like every season they would have all the fighters from all the fights booked for like the next 6 months on stage at once, and it did create a sense of community in a weird way where it's like these are all the personalities you're going to be seeing over the next 6 months. They're all going to interact with each other, anticipate these fights. But in the current era, they don't even have officially like the card booked for say September right now, and that's something that didn't used to be the case before COVID. They would have the schedule laid out like 6 7 months in advance, and now it's just kind of very haphazard and pulling fights together at the last minute because they know the brand is so powerful that the exact names on the card don't matter. I know things like fighter unions have been talked about. Supposedly Jake Paul and Anderson Silva are working together to create a fighters union. Um, I do not know what to think about a Jake Paul venture into anything, business wise or union wise. I don't know if he's the right guy to do it. That's yet to be seen. But definitely, fighters need to have some form of individual and collective power, and they just don't have that. And I don't know the best way for them to get that because it is such an individual sport that people just kind of take their opportunities. Like if at the highest level, one fighter is in a contract negotiation and drops out of a fight, the number 4 ranked guy in that division who wasn't going to get a title shot, if now they offer it to him, he's hugely incentivized to just step in and take that slot because he wasn't going to get a shot anyway. This is his chance now. And it would take a lot in order to convince someone to, not take that fight out of solidarity with another
Mhm.
fighter and another fighter who they may later be asked to fight against. So it would be really hard to kind of get that solidarity at the highest levels. But I think sort of at the lowest levels is where a lot of the help is needed, where a lot of these guys are on like a $10,000 to show and $10,000 to win contract, which if you win 3 times in a year and get a performance bonus, great, you're rich. But most fighters are going to like lose 2 times, or like win one, lose one, and then get injured and not be able to fight and like be out for 8 months. They're just making almost no money. But a lot of help is needed in the financial regard. But then just in terms of the personality of the sport, they need to do bigger press conferences, more press conferences, going around the world, going to these markets. Like they were in Japan, they were in you know Kazakhstan. I mean, they have a champion, former champion from Kazakhstan. They could do that, but they've been talking about UFC Africa for like 3 years, and they've had
Really?
three Africa, yeah, and they've had like three different African champions. And I believe just due to efficiency, it just makes more financial sense to put those fights in Las Vegas. And then what do you know? All the African champions ended up losing, and then now they don't really have that solid championship base anymore. They have Dricus du Plessis and Israel Adesanya, who it's a South Africa versus Nigeria, and so they could have put that in Africa, but they put it in Australia because that's just one of the international markets that they routinely come back to. Like they just have all these contracts where it's like once a year we go to Australia, once a year we go to Abu Dhabi for a pay-per-view. Now they've introduced Saudi Arabia, which has become the big new fight hub for boxing and the UFC. It's completely taken over, where all the biggest boxing fights are taking place in Saudi Arabia. So it's just these contracts with very specific high profile places. And then the whole schedule gets organized around that, where it's like, we just have to pull together an Australian champ to have the Australia pay per view on this date. We have to have a Muslim fighter or a fighter from the Middle East fighting on the Abu Dhabi card. So Islam Makhachev, if he's injured, God forbid, then we've got nobody for that whole card.
Yeah.
It just becomes very defined by specific high profile places they want to go. And then in between the fight nights, just kind of completely fall through the cracks. So they really just have to get out there on the road more. But it's probably a money saver to just throw in the fights with no crowd and just get paid the lump sum from ESPN and Disney, rather than just trying to have on their own work up ticket sales, market individual events and individual fighters to build up individual events into big things. Their whole current business strategy is just let Disney pay us flat and we'll just churn out content. So the ESPN deal is up, I believe, this year or next year. I really hope there's a big change there, but who knows what that change will be. I mean, I know Netflix is getting into boxing and things like that, so maybe the UFC would make a deal with Netflix or something like that. But yeah, I don't know how that would affect things. Probably just kind of churning out content would also be the model there. I would have to think, unless less events would probably not be what a big streamer wants. They'd probably want more watch hours. So it's
Yeah.
very tough to say.
Yeah. So if people want to hear more about your takes on UFC, they should get a copy of the zine. Still have copies
Yes.
available. But if they want to read some of the other stuff you've written, Alex, where can they follow your stuff?
Definitely. I have a website, www.alexanderblum.net. Have a lot of old essays on there. I've kind of been doing a lot of screenwriting lately, so not as much essay writing, but it is something that I do want to continue doing. So we'll see. Maybe there will be some new essays on that website in the months and years to come. And yeah, definitely can go to the website there. And there's a lot of content there that I do think is still really good, and on kind of a variety of topics of theology, or like symbolism in video games, and like how Moby Dick relates to like the video game Sekiro, like things like that. If that kind of stuff interests you, you might like that.
Awesome. Well, Alex, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much, and really glad to have written for the zine. And everybody, go buy a copy. It's really good.
All right.